On a quiet, crisp morning in a small suburban town, Isaiah Martin's life would change forever. He had woken up like any other day, his alarm ringing, a quick shower, breakfast that consisted of a steaming mug of black coffee and a piece of toast. Nothing about his routine had been different, nothing suggested that this ordinary, predictable morning would unravel into something that would alter the course of his life, and the lives of those around him, in ways no one could have foreseen. Isaiah was a man who blended in, a successful entrepreneur with a humble but respected reputation in the town. He ran a small auto repair shop, where everyone knew him as a quiet, hard-working figure, a person who didn't seek attention but commanded respect through his unassuming demeanor. To most, Isaiah was the kind of man you could rely on, the kind of neighbor who would help you jumpstart your car or lend you a tool without a second thought. No one knew about his past, no one knew what he had done before arriving in this sleepy town, far from the life he once lived. But that morning, as Isaiah drove his black sedan through the sleepy streets of the town, he had no idea that two police officers, Officer Hayes and Officer Mitchell, had just set their eyes on him. They had no reason to stop him at first. There was nothing extraordinary about the way he drove or the way he appeared. But these officers, who were no strangers to prejudice, harbored assumptions that would soon lead to a life-altering chain of events. Officer Hayes, a man with a history of racial bias, saw the way Isaiah's black sedan gleamed in the sunlight. Something about it bothered him. There was an arrogance in how the car shone, in how Isaiah carried himself. To Hayes, it was all too familiar, a symbol of defiance, of something he couldn't place. He told his partner to pull him over. As Isaiah's car slowed to a stop, his mind was on nothing but the mundane tasks of the day ahead. He hadn't noticed the flashing lights in his rearview mirror until the sirens broke through the morning silence. The officers, their expressions cold and their posture stiff, approached his car. Isaiah rolled down his window, greeting them with a calm nod. "Good morning, officer," Isaiah said, his tone neutral, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He had no reason to be nervous. After all, he'd done nothing wrong. Officer Hayes, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon, scanned Isaiah. "Can I ask you to step out of the vehicle?" Hayes asked, his words curt, even though there was no immediate cause for concern. His voice carried an edge, an unwarranted aggression that Isaiah couldn't quite place. "Is there a problem, officer?" Isaiah's voice remained steady. He hadn't expected to be interrogated, not in his own town, where he had been nothing but respectful and law-abiding. "We'll decide that after we check your car," Hayes replied coldly. He motioned to Mitchell, who circled around the vehicle. There was an unsettling air of hostility in their movements, something that Isaiah, despite his calm nature, could sense. He had faced men like them before, men who saw him not for who he was, but for the color of his skin. Isaiah had always carried a certain sense of serenity in the face of adversity. It was a quality honed over years of service in the military, where he had learned how to read a room and, most importantly, how to keep his emotions in check. But today, as he sat in his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. He'd encountered prejudice in his past, but never in this town. The thought that it could happen here, of all places, was something he hadn't allowed himself to entertain. Still, he wasn't foolish enough to believe he was immune. Mitchell, who had been circling the car with his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, approached the driver's side again, a look of irritation on his face. He peered through the window, eyes narrowing, as if he was searching for something. "What's in the back seat?" he asked abruptly, his voice more accusatory than curious. Isaiah's gaze followed Mitchell's. "Just some tools," he said simply. The back seat was cluttered with work equipment, like oil cans and mechanic tools, nothing unusual, nothing out of place. "We'll see for ourselves," Hayes said, his voice sharp now. Without warning, he opened the door and gestured for Isaiah to step out. Something about the way Hayes moved, the tension in his body, made Isaiah's instincts flare. He knew this wasn't just a random stop. They were looking for something, anything, to cause trouble. Maybe they didn't like the car. Maybe they didn't like the way he dressed. Maybe they didn't like him simply because of his race. But whatever the reason, Isaiah knew this wasn't a routine traffic stop anymore. He could feel the weight of it, the simmering hostility that had shifted from subtle to overt. "What's this about?" Isaiah asked, his voice calm but firm. He had never been the type to back down. Especially when it came to unjust authority. "You'll see soon enough," Hayes replied, ignoring the question. He snapped his fingers at Mitchell, and the officer began to rifle through the contents of the back seat. Isaiah remained silent, watching them. The silence stretched between them, the tension palpable. The moment felt like it lasted forever, but only a few minutes passed before Mitchell found something that caught his attention. He pulled out a small, black object from under the seat, an item so nondescript it could have been a standard piece of equipment. But to Mitchell, it was suspicious. Something about the device seemed to trigger a gut reaction, a recognition that Isaiah couldn't have anticipated. They had no idea what it really was, an advanced communication device used in covert operations, but it was enough to make the officers pause. They didn't know Isaiah's true identity, but they sensed that something was off. And in their minds, that meant he was guilty of something, even if they couldn't prove it. Isaiah's heart began to race. He knew what they were thinking. It was the kind of feeling he had learned to suppress over years of service, the knowledge that in their eyes, he was already guilty before they even knew the facts. But instead of panic, a calm resolve filled him. He had been trained for moments like this. He knew the game, and he knew how to play it. But he couldn't afford to reveal who he really was, not yet. Not when he wasn't sure if they had made the connection. Hayes eyed the object suspiciously, his brow furrowed. "What is this?" he demanded. Isaiah met his gaze with a steady stare. "It's just a tool," he said, his voice low, knowing that the less they knew, the better. But Hayes was persistent, his mind working in overdrive, assuming the worst. "This is going to need a deeper look," Hayes muttered, motioning for Mitchell to call in the backup. They were determined to escalate the situation, and they were about to cross a line Isaiah had hoped they would never approach. Without warning, Hayes reached into his belt, his fingers brushing the grip of his gun. But before the situation could spiral further, Isaiah did something that no one expected. With a calmness that bordered on eerie, he stepped away from the car and into the street, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "What are you doing?" Mitchell demanded, his hand hovering near his taser. Isaiah looked directly at him, a quiet defiance in his eyes. "I'm done standing here," he said quietly. "But you'll regret what you're about to do." The officers didn't understand. They didn't know Isaiah, didn't know who he really was. And as they stood there, trying to make sense of what was happening, Isaiah knew that his calmness, his quiet confidence, would soon be the very thing that turned the tide. What they didn't realize was that they weren't just confronting an ordinary man. They were confronting someone far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The two officers exchanged uneasy glances, unaware that their actions were about to ignite a sequence of events that would expose them, and change Isaiah's life forever. But it was too late to stop now. The stage had been set, and all Isaiah had to do was play his part. What happened next would be beyond anyone's control. The morning after the confrontation, Isaiah found himself sitting at the kitchen table, the quiet hum of the coffee machine filling the room. His fingers gently wrapped around the warm mug of coffee as he stared into the steaming liquid, lost in thought. The events of the day before felt like a dream, a surreal nightmare that seemed to stretch the boundaries of reality. He had been a part of something much bigger than he had ever intended, and it had set off a chain reaction that he could never have predicted. Yet, there he was, back at his small house, as if nothing had happened. But of course, things could never be the same again. As he took a sip of his coffee, his mind wandered back to the events of yesterday. The police officers, Hayes and Mitchell, had been determined to escalate a simple traffic stop into something more, something dangerous. The way they treated him with such disdain, the way they were so quick to assume guilt, made him feel like a pawn in a game that he never signed up for. But it wasn't just about them, it was about something much larger, a systemic issue of prejudice and ignorance that ran deep in the veins of this small town. Isaiah's life had always been about keeping a low profile. He had moved to this town years ago after retiring from a career in the military. His previous life had been nothing short of extraordinary, full of covert missions, high-level assignments, and the kind of work that required him to blend in with his surroundings. But once he was out, once he had the chance to breathe freely, he chose to leave all that behind. The past was a weight that he wasn't ready to carry anymore. He wanted peace, a chance to heal and find balance in a world that had asked so much of him. The town had embraced him, despite his mysterious past. He had been a mechanic, a simple man with a simple job, working quietly behind the scenes to keep the cars of the local community running. He had built a reputation for being trustworthy and reliable. The people of the town didn't know his real story. They didn't know the kind of world he had come from, the world of spies, of secrets, of lives lived in shadows. They didn't know that the same hands that fixed engines could have just as easily dismantled a bomb or taken down an enemy agent. They didn't know that Isaiah Martin wasn't just a mechanic, he was an undercover agent who had worked for years on operations that could change the world. But all of that had been behind him, or so he thought. The reality was that when he had moved to the town, he had hoped for peace, for a fresh start. But peace was an illusion, and he couldn't outrun the past forever. Yesterday's incident with the police officers had forced him to face the truth, he could never truly escape who he was. As the hours passed and the day unfolded in its usual rhythm, Isaiah went about his business with a new sense of awareness. Every step, every interaction, felt different. It was like walking through a world where he no longer belonged, but had no choice but to continue walking. The fear, the dread of the unknown, weighed heavily on his shoulders. He could already feel the ripple effects of what had happened. His town, his community, was about to change forever. It didn't take long for the rumors to spread. The people of the town, always quick to gossip, had already begun piecing together the details. The incident with the police was all anyone could talk about. Everyone had their theories. Some said that Isaiah was simply an innocent man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, while others speculated that he had some dark secret, some hidden past that had finally come to light. It didn't help that the officers involved had been tight-lipped about the details. The few who had witnessed the confrontation were left with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain, the town was buzzing, and Isaiah's life was no longer his own. He could feel the eyes on him as he walked down the street, could hear the hushed whispers as people tried to piece together his story. The peaceful existence he had once known was slipping away, and in its place was a growing sense of unease that settled over him like a storm cloud. At the local diner, the usual hum of conversation stopped when Isaiah walked in. The waitress, who usually greeted him with a warm smile, now eyed him with caution, her lips pressed into a thin line. Isaiah felt the weight of every gaze in the room as he sat down at his usual booth. The silence was almost suffocating, but he didn't let it faze him. He had faced worse before, much worse. He knew how to keep his composure, how to remain calm even when the world around him was on the brink of chaos. The waitress finally approached him, her hands shaking slightly as she placed a menu in front of him. "What can I get you today, Isaiah?" Her voice was steady, but there was a nervous edge to it. "I'll have the usual," Isaiah replied, his voice low and even. As she walked away, Isaiah couldn't help but notice the way the other patrons looked at him. Some with curiosity, others with suspicion. It was clear that the small-town atmosphere he had once known so well was starting to turn. People didn't know what to make of him anymore. They didn't know what to believe. But it wasn't just the townsfolk who were watching him. Isaiah could feel the presence of something bigger lurking in the background. The moment the police had stopped him, he had sensed that there was more to the situation than a simple case of prejudice. He had felt the weight of their suspicion, the way they had looked at him not as a man, but as a threat. And the way they had reacted when they found the communication device in his car, it had been enough to make them question everything. Isaiah knew that the cops had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea that he was part of something much bigger than a small-town mechanic. They didn't know that he was a former military operative, trained in the most covert operations, skilled in intelligence gathering, and well-versed in the art of deception. They didn't know that his life had been shaped by missions that required him to be invisible, to be a ghost in a world full of noise. The device they had found in his car, the one that had sent them into a frenzy of suspicion, was a tool he had used during his time in the field. It was nothing more than a communication device, a simple piece of technology that allowed him to stay connected to his team during covert operations. But to Hayes and Mitchell, it was a red flag, something that hinted at a deeper conspiracy. They had no way of knowing the truth, and for now, Isaiah intended to keep it that way. But as the day wore on, Isaiah's mind raced. He knew that it was only a matter of time before the cops started digging deeper into his past. They would investigate him, they would search for any connection to a larger network. And when they found nothing, when they realized that he was connected to the kind of operations that could bring down corrupt systems, they would have no choice but to confront him. He had become a threat in their eyes, a person who didn't fit into the neat, comfortable boxes they had built for themselves. The question was, what would they do when they realized who he really was? Isaiah wasn't sure what the next steps would be, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't stay in the shadows forever. His past had caught up with him, and now he had to make a choice. Would he reveal the truth about who he was, about what he had been doing, or would he allow the investigation to unfold on its own, knowing that the consequences could be far-reaching? The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, Isaiah's sense of unease had only deepened. He had spent the night turning over the events in his mind, replaying every word, every interaction, and the way the police officers had looked at him. The lingering tension from the previous day hadn't faded. If anything, it had only grown stronger, thicker, like the fog that sometimes rolled into town in the early hours, swallowing everything in its path. It was a fog that obscured the truth, distorted perceptions, and left behind a creeping sense of something unspoken, something dangerous just beyond the surface. Isaiah had always been able to read people, to sense their thoughts before they fully formed, to understand the subtle shifts in their body language, their eyes, the way they breathed when they were lying or hiding something. But this situation, this one was different. The stakes had never been higher, and the players were more unpredictable than anything he had ever encountered. He couldn't shake the feeling that the officers' actions were just the beginning, that something far more sinister was at play, something much bigger than the small-town incident it seemed to be. As the hours ticked by, Isaiah tried to go about his day as usual. He had a car to fix, a customer expecting a job to be done, and the rhythms of his mechanic shop were like second nature. But even as his hands worked with the same precision and skill he had honed over the years, his mind never strayed far from what had happened the day before. The more he thought about the officer's reaction to the communication device, the more certain he became that their suspicion wasn't about him being an ordinary man caught in a routine stop. No, they knew there was something more, something they didn't understand yet, but would soon enough. They had seen the device, recognized it as something out of place in their narrow worldview, and now they were searching for answers. The next few days were filled with a nervous energy that Isaiah couldn't shake. He kept his head down, working in his shop, pretending that nothing was wrong, even as everything around him began to change. Word had gotten out about the altercation with the police, and the town was buzzing. Some were still on his side, defending him as an innocent man just trying to live his life. Others, however, had started to question everything they knew about him. Whispers of a hidden past, of rumors that Isaiah was more As the sun began to set and the shadows grew longer, Isaiah made a decision. He would confront this head-on. He would take control of his own narrative before someone else twisted it. But little did he know, the path he was about to walk would be filled with danger, intrigue, and an unexpected twist that would change everything. The town's secrets were about to be laid bare. And Isaiah would find himself at the center of it all. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, Isaiah's sense of unease had only deepened. He had spent the night turning over the events in his mind, replaying every word, every interaction, and the way the police officers had looked at him. The lingering tension from the previous day hadn't faded. If anything, it had only grown stronger, thicker, like the fog that sometimes rolled into town in the early hours, swallowing everything in its path. It was a fog that obscured the truth, distorted perceptions, and left behind a creeping sense of something unspoken, something dangerous just beyond the surface. Isaiah had always been able to read people, to sense their thoughts before they fully formed, to understand the subtle shifts in their body language, their eyes, the way they breathed when they were lying or hiding something. But this situation, this one was different. The stakes had never been higher, and the players were more unpredictable than anything he had ever encountered. He couldn't shake the feeling that the officers' actions were just the beginning, that something far more sinister was at play, something much bigger than the small-town incident it seemed to be. As the hours ticked by, Isaiah tried to go about his day as usual. He had a car to fix, a customer expecting a job to be done, and the rhythms of his mechanic shop were like second nature. But even as his hands worked with the same precision and skill he had honed over the years, his mind never strayed far from what had happened the day before. The more he thought about the officer's reaction to the communication device, the more certain he became that their suspicion wasn't about him being an ordinary man caught in a routine stop. No, they knew there was something more, something they didn't understand yet, but would soon enough. They had seen the device, recognized it as something out of place in their narrow worldview, and now they were searching for answers. The next few days were filled with a nervous energy that Isaiah couldn't shake. He kept his head down, working in his shop, pretending that nothing was wrong, even as everything around him began to change. Word had gotten out about the altercation with the police, and the town was buzzing. Some were still on his side, defending him as an innocent man just trying to live his life. Others, however, had started to question everything they knew about him. Whispers of a hidden past, of rumors that Isaiah was more than just a mechanic, began to spread. But it wasn't just the townsfolk who were starting to ask questions. The local police had begun their own investigation into Isaiah's background, following up on the unusual device they had found. They had made inquiries at his shop, poking around for anything that might suggest he was more than just a retired soldier turned mechanic. It didn't take long before they began to connect the dots, linking his background in the military with the strange technology they had discovered. They dug deeper, making phone calls to people from his past, contacting anyone who might have information about his life before he had come to their town. The pieces were slowly falling into place, and it wasn't long before they realized that Isaiah was no ordinary man. But what they didn't know, what they could never have predicted, was just how deep his connections went. Isaiah had always been careful, too careful perhaps, in concealing the details of his past. He had spent years working undercover for organizations that operated in the shadows, dealing with international intelligence, covert operations, and missions that would never be revealed to the public. It was a world of secrecy, where identities were hidden, and everything was classified. His time in the military had been a cover for an even more secretive life, a life that, if exposed, could bring down governments, shatter alliances, and destroy lives. Isaiah had been a ghost, blending into the background of the world, doing the work that needed to be done without anyone knowing who he really was. But now, with the police investigation underway, his past was starting to surface, and it was only a matter of time before it came crashing down on him. Isaiah knew that he couldn't stay hidden forever. The officers, Hayes and Mitchell, had made it clear that they were digging deeper into his life, and with each passing day, the walls were closing in. He could feel their presence, the growing tension in the air. They were watching him, waiting for him to slip up, to reveal something they could use against him. And Isaiah knew that the longer he stayed silent, the more dangerous it would become. Sooner or later, he would have to confront them, reveal the truth about who he really was. It wasn't an easy decision. Isaiah had always been a man of action, not words. He had spent years in the shadows, doing what needed to be done, but never wanting recognition. He had walked away from that life, hoping to never have to return to it. But he realized now that his quiet life in the small town was over. The secrets he had buried so deep were rising to the surface, and there was no way to stop it. The thought of returning to his old life, of stepping back into the world of espionage and covert operations, was terrifying. He had left that world behind for a reason. The people he had worked with, the organizations he had been a part of, they were not the kind of people you could easily escape from. Once you were in for life. But Isaiah had never expected that something as simple as a traffic stop could bring it all back. And yet, here he was, standing at the crossroads of his past and present, knowing that his decisions in the coming days would determine everything. Would he face the police and reveal his true identity, or would he keep the secrets buried and hope that they would go away? As the days went on, Isaiah's anxiety grew. The cops were getting closer, and he knew that it wouldn't be long before they confronted him directly. He couldn't hide forever, and he knew that his silence would only raise more suspicion. He needed to act before they made the first move. Then, one evening, as he was closing up shop for the night, he received an unexpected visit. It was Officer Hayes, standing at the door with a stern look on his face. There was no small talk, no pleasantries, just the cold, hard reality of the situation. "We need to talk," Hayes said, his voice low and firm. Isaiah stood still for a moment, his heart racing. He could feel the weight of the moment, the tension thick in the air. This was it, the confrontation he had been avoiding. "I'm listening," Isaiah said, his voice steady. "I think you know why I'm here," Hayes said, stepping into the shop without waiting for an invitation. "You're not who you say you are." Isaiah's mind raced. He could tell that Hayes had already figured out something was off. The pieces were falling into place, and the officer wasn't about to back down now. "I'm just a mechanic," Isaiah said, maintaining his calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." But Hayes wasn't buying it. He had spent the past few days digging into Isaiah's past, and now he was ready to confront him with what he had uncovered. "You're not just a mechanic," Hayes said, his voice hardening. "We know about your military background. We know about the device we found in your car. You're hiding something. And we're going to find out what it is." Isaiah's pulse quickened, but he didn't let the officer see it. He knew that this was the moment when everything would change. "I'm not hiding anything," Isaiah said, but his words carried less weight now. Hayes could see through the facade. The game was up. For a long moment, the two men stood in silence, the tension between them palpable. Finally, Hayes spoke again, his voice quieter, more calculating. "You don't have to play this game, Isaiah," he said, his eyes narrowing. "We can make this easy or hard. The choice is yours." Isaiah knew that his options were limited. He had a choice to make: reveal the truth about who he was, or risk everything. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. There was no turning back now. "I'm not playing any games," Isaiah said, his voice firm, resolute. "But you need to understand something: this isn't just about you and me. This goes much deeper than that." Hayes blinked, his expression shifting from aggression to confusion. "What are you talking about?" Isaiah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath, weighing his options. He knew that his life would never be the same again, but at least he had control over what came next. And so, with one final look at Hayes, Isaiah made his decision. It's time you learned the truth, he said, his voice low but steady. But it's going to change everything. As Isaiah spoke the words, he could feel the weight of his past crashing into his present. The life he had left behind was about to catch up with him, and there would be no turning back. The evening air was thick with tension as Isaiah led Officer Hayes into the back room of his small mechanic shop, away from prying eyes and the watchful stares of the few remaining customers. The overhead lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows that seemed to dance against the walls, echoing the unease that hung between the two men. Isaiah's hands trembled ever so slightly, but he steadied them against the workbench as he motioned to the chair. "Sit," he said, his voice more measured than he felt. He could sense Hayes's wariness, his posture rigid, as though ready for anything, but also not fully prepared for what was about to unfold. Isaiah closed the door behind them, sealing them off from the world outside, the noise of the street muffled as the room fell silent except for the distant hum of machinery. For a moment, the only sound was the beating of his own heart, and the weight of the decision he had just made settled heavily upon his chest. This was the moment when everything would change. There was no going back now. Hayes didn't sit down right away. Instead, he stood near the door, arms crossed, eyes sharp as he studied Isaiah. The air between them felt charged, as if the officer was waiting for Isaiah to say something that would give him the upper hand. It didn't matter that Isaiah had just acknowledged the truth, he knew Hayes needed more than just words. The truth was dangerous. The truth was something no one in this small town was prepared to hear. Isaiah took a deep breath and finally spoke, his voice steady but laced with a quiet urgency. "I know what you're thinking," he began, his eyes meeting Hayes's. "You're wondering how far I'll go to protect my secrets. You're thinking that I'm just another person with a past, someone who's hiding behind a facade. But you don't understand. My past isn't just something I can bury. It's something that could change everything. For you. For your department. For this town." Hayes's expression didn't shift. He was still processing the fragmented truths, piecing them together in his mind. He was a cop, used to seeing the world in black and white, right and wrong. He wasn't prepared for the gray area that Isaiah was about to pull him into. He narrowed his eyes, the skepticism still thick in his voice. "I'm listening," he said, though his tone suggested that he didn't quite believe Isaiah's words yet. "But I don't know if I can just take your word for it." Isaiah met his gaze with an intensity that didn't falter. "I wasn't just a soldier, Hayes. I wasn't just a part of some military operation. I was in a world of shadows. A world where the line between right and wrong is blurred beyond recognition. A world that's hidden from the public's eye for a reason. You think you've seen the worst in the world? Trust me, you haven't. I've lived it." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "I've seen the things that could ruin lives, tear down entire governments, and expose corruption on a scale that would change how you see everything. What you don't understand is that I didn't choose this life. It was thrust upon me. And now, the people who brought me into this world are trying to pull me back in." The silence in the room grew heavier as Hayes absorbed Isaiah's words. His jaw tightened, and for the first time since he had walked in, he seemed to question what he thought he knew. Isaiah wasn't the man he had assumed him to be. And that realization didn't sit well with Hayes. The officer had his own sense of justice, his own way of seeing the world, but now Isaiah was asking him to step into a new world, one where nothing was certain, and the rules didn't apply the way they should. Isaiah could see the change in Hayes's expression, the shift from disbelief to contemplation. He knew Hayes wasn't quite ready to accept the full weight of his words, but he also knew he couldn't hold back any longer. The stakes were too high. "I've spent years hiding from that world," Isaiah continued, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. "I came here to this town because I thought I could leave it all behind. I thought I could disappear. But you saw the device. You dug into my past, and now you've uncovered something you weren't meant to. I'm not just some mechanic. I'm a former secret agent, and the people I used to work for? They're still out there. Watching. Waiting. His words carried the heaviness of experience, of scars that no one could see. And you, Hayes, you've now stepped into a world you can't walk away from. The moment you started digging into my life, you became part of it. The officer's face twisted with confusion. So, what now? You expect me to just let you walk away? To pretend like nothing's happened? His voice had started to rise, the tension in the room thickening. Isaiah stood, his presence imposing despite his quiet demeanor. You can't just walk away from this. Not anymore. If you think you're going to get away with some simple investigation and call it a day, you're wrong. I'm not the only one with secrets, Hayes. Your department? Your town? There are things going on here you don't even know about. I'm not the only one being watched. The officer's brows furrowed. What are you talking about? What could be happening in this small town that's bigger than you and me? Isaiah looked at him, his eyes dark with the weight of years spent in secrecy. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. But I'm not here to ask for your trust. I'm asking for your help. The words hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. Isaiah could see the conflict brewing inside Hayes. He wasn't sure whether to trust him, whether to believe that what Isaiah was saying was real. But the officer had seen something in the device, something that had struck a chord with him, even if he couldn't fully comprehend its implications. I don't know what you want me to do, Hayes muttered, still uncertain. Isaiah's voice lowered, his tone more measured now, as though he had been anticipating this moment for some time. You can't do this alone. You think you can bring me in, put me in a cell, and think everything will go back to normal? No. There's a bigger game at play here. People are involved who will stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. They won't hesitate to silence you. They won't hesitate to silence anyone who gets too close. And right now, you're too close. Hayes took a step back, his mind racing. He was a cop, and cops didn't deal in conspiracy theories, especially ones as elaborate as what Isaiah was suggesting. The officer had always believed in the black and white nature of the world, the good guys versus the bad guys, the law and the lawless. But now he was being asked to consider something far darker, far more complex. The problem was, he didn't know who the good guys were anymore. I can't just walk away from this, Hayes said, his voice quieter now, a flicker of doubt creeping into his words. This is bigger than me. Isaiah nodded slowly. Exactly. And it's bigger than both of us. But if we don't stand up to it, if we don't do something now, then the town we know, everything we've taken for granted, will be gone. This is just the beginning. The officer ran a hand through his hair, the weight of Isaiah's words settling heavily on him. There was a long silence between them, one filled with unspoken questions, fears, and the realization that their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't fully anticipate. Where do we start? Hayes asked quietly, his voice laced with both uncertainty and resolve. Isaiah took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as he began to move toward the back of the shop, pulling out a small box from beneath the workbench. He opened it, revealing a set of encrypted files, maps, and documents that had been carefully hidden from public eyes. These weren't the sorts of things any ordinary person should have, and Isaiah knew that once Hayes saw them, there would be no turning back. We start here, Isaiah said softly, handing Hayes the file. But I warn you, once you open this, there's no going back. As Hayes took the file in his hands, his face pale but determined, Isaiah knew that this was no longer about the past or the mistakes. Hayes stared at the file in his hands, his mind spinning. The weight of the paper seemed heavier than it should have been, as though it contained not just information but the potential to unravel everything he thought he understood about the world. As he flipped through the encrypted documents and cryptic maps, his eyes flickered from one item to the next. Each piece was more bizarre than the last, each more difficult to digest. The pages were filled with names, numbers, coordinates, and codes that made no sense to him. But one thing was clear: these weren't the kinds of files any regular mechanic had access to. Isaiah stood silently by, watching Hayes's reaction closely. The officer was still processing, his confusion evident as he tried to connect the dots, but Isaiah knew the man had no choice now. He had already stepped too far into the world Isaiah had left behind. There was no turning back. "What is all this?" Hayes asked, his voice hoarse as he finally looked up from the file. He had to ask, but a part of him already knew the answer. Isaiah sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew this moment was coming. This was the point of no return. "It's everything you need to know. Everything about the people I used to work for, about the things I did before I came here. The people who are still watching, still controlling things behind the scenes. You think the corruption in this town is isolated? You think the world is as simple as good versus bad? You're wrong, Hayes. This is bigger. Much bigger." The words hung heavily in the air. Hayes closed the file slowly, almost reverently, and placed it on the table in front of him. The shock still hadn't worn off, and the weight of the truth was like a brick they had made. It was about a future that had already begun unfolding, one that would drag them both into a world that few were ever meant to see. The game had begun, and they were already players in a dangerous, high-stakes world where the rules didn't apply. The consequences of their decisions would be felt far beyond the town, far beyond the small world they thought they knew. And as Hayes glanced over the files, the door to a new, uncharted reality slowly creaked open. Lodged in his chest. He had always thought he understood the complexities of the law, the hidden truths beneath the surface of society. But this was something else entirely. What was it Isaiah was asking him to see? What was he supposed to do with this newfound knowledge? Isaiah watched him closely, understanding the turmoil that must be coursing through Hayes's mind. He could feel the officer's uncertainty, but it wasn't just fear that made Hayes hesitate, it was something deeper. Something he didn't yet understand. Isaiah had seen it before, the internal struggle of someone being forced to confront the truth, knowing it would change their life forever. "You can't unsee this, Hayes," Isaiah said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "You can't just walk away and pretend it doesn't matter anymore. You have to make a choice. You can stay in the dark, keep pretending everything is fine, or you can help me take this down. But make no mistake, if you choose the latter, it's going to cost you." Hayes swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edges of the file, his knuckles turning white. He wasn't sure what scared him more, the threat of the people Isaiah spoke of, or the realization that everything he had known about his town, his life, was now in question. The things Isaiah had revealed couldn't be easily ignored. His duty as an officer was clear: he had to uphold the law, protect his community, but the law was no longer black and white. It had become as complicated as the encrypted files in front of him. "You're asking me to join you," Hayes said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "To do what exactly? To go after these people? To expose them?" Isaiah nodded, his expression hard. "Yes. It's the only way to stop them. The files, the information in that folder, it's the key. It's proof of the conspiracy that goes deeper than anyone could imagine. But there's more to it than that. These people won't just roll over because we know their secrets. They'll come for us. They'll do whatever it takes to make sure the truth stays buried. That's why I need you." Hayes's mind raced. This was no longer just about protecting a community, it was about protecting himself, his family, and his future. The law had always been something he believed in, but now, it felt like a tool being wielded by forces beyond his control. The lines between right and wrong, good and evil, had blurred so much that they were barely recognizable. "I don't know if I can do this," Hayes murmured, shaking his head. "I've spent my whole career upholding the law. How do I even begin to fight something like this? How do I know who's on our side and who's part of this conspiracy? Isaiah stepped forward, his gaze unflinching. I don't have all the answers. I can't promise you that it will be easy. But I can tell you this, you won't be alone. There are others who know the truth, others who want to see this system fall. It's not just me and you. The people who are behind all of this, they're afraid of what will happen if the truth comes out. And they'll stop at nothing to keep it hidden. Hayes ran a hand over his face, his mind spinning with the weight of the decision in front of him. He had always thought he knew what was right and wrong, what the law demanded. But now, everything was shifting, and the very foundation of his beliefs was being shaken to its core. I can't make this decision right now, Hayes said finally, his voice filled with uncertainty. I need time to think. Isaiah's eyes softened slightly, but there was still a hint of urgency in his gaze. Time is something we don't have. Every minute we waste is another minute they're planning, another minute they're pulling strings behind the scenes. You've already seen how far they'll go to protect their secrets. Hayes stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth across the small room. The file, the information, everything Isaiah had told him, it was too much to process. He had seen the corruption in the department, the shady dealings and backroom politics, but nothing had prepared him for this. How could he have known that the very people he worked for, the ones he had trusted, were part of something so much bigger, so much more dangerous than he could have imagined? I don't know if I can trust you, Hayes said finally, stopping in his tracks. His voice was thick with doubt. How do I know you're not just trying to pull me into this mess to cover your own tracks? Isaiah's eyes hardened, a trace of something darker in them. You don't. But you'll have to decide soon. I'm not asking you to trust me, Hayes. I'm asking you to see the truth. The truth you've already started uncovering. It's all in front of you. You just have to choose whether or not you're willing to act on it. Hayes stared at Isaiah for a long moment, his mind churning. He had always prided himself on being a man of principle, of doing what was right no matter the cost. But now, he was faced with a decision that didn't have a simple answer. The truth was ugly, complicated, and dangerous. It was a truth that could tear apart everything he had built his life upon. I don't know if I can do this alone, Hayes said quietly, the weight of his words sinking in. Isaiah's response was a low, almost imperceptible nod. You don't have to. I'll be here every step of the way. But you need to make your choice. And you need to make it soon. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the tension between them thick and palpable. Hayes knew that whatever choice he made next, it would change everything. He had already come too far to turn back, but now he had to decide how far he was willing to go. Finally, Hayes exhaled, his mind made up. I'm in. But I'm not doing this just for you. I'm doing it for the truth. Whatever it takes. Isaiah's gaze softened, just slightly, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. We'll make sure it's worth it. We'll make sure the truth is heard. With that, the door to the back room of the mechanic's shop closed behind them. The world outside had not changed, but for Hayes and Isaiah, everything had shifted. They were now part of something much bigger, something that would take them down a dangerous path, one that would forever alter the course of their lives, and the future of their town. The battle was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than either of them could have ever imagined. As the days wore on, Hayes found himself drawn deeper into the underworld of the conspiracy. The world he had once known, the comfortable, structured life as a police officer in his small town, began to feel like a distant memory. Every step he took, every door he opened, seemed to reveal a new layer of deception, a new betrayal. Isaiah was right about one thing, the truth was bigger than either of them could have anticipated. At first, Hayes had been overwhelmed, unsure of what to believe, torn between his sense of duty and the revelations Isaiah had shown him. But now, as he dove further into the dark heart of the system, the pieces began to fall into place. He could see how it all connected: the corrupt officers in the department, the shady businessmen with ties to organized crime, the shadowy figures pulling strings from behind the scenes. They weren't just pulling off petty crimes, they were orchestrating a symphony of manipulation and control that stretched far beyond the town's borders. It was hard to know who he could trust. Isaiah, for all his bravado and hard-edged resolve, was still an enigma to him. There were moments when Hayes could see the raw pain in his eyes, the ghosts of past decisions haunting him. He wasn't sure if Isaiah was a man on a mission or someone who had lost everything in his pursuit of the truth. But one thing was clear: Isaiah had been right about everything. The corruption ran deep, and it wasn't just in the police department, it was woven into every level of society. The people who controlled this town, this world, were powerful and ruthless. And they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Hayes had begun to dig into the files Isaiah had given him, decoding the encrypted documents with a mix of determination and desperation. Each file uncovered new evidence, a new piece of the puzzle, and the deeper he went, the more he realized how dangerous it all was. Some of the names on those documents were people he had known for years, respected figures in the community, business owners, even politicians. They were all involved in a web of illegal activities that spanned decades, a network of corruption that was designed to protect the powerful and keep the rest of the world in the dark. But there were moments of clarity, too. Hayes wasn't entirely alone in his search for the truth. There were others who had been working behind the scenes for years, quietly gathering evidence and making plans. They had been waiting for someone like him, someone with the courage to stand up and challenge the system. Hayes was beginning to understand the true scale of what was at stake, and he could feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. One night, as he sat alone in his apartment, poring over the files once again, his phone rang. It was Isaiah. Hayes hesitated for a moment before answering. He hadn't spoken to him in a few days, and there was an unmistakable sense of urgency in the air. "We need to talk," Isaiah's voice came through the phone, tense and serious. "It's happening. They know we're on to them." Hayes's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "Who knows? The people behind all this. The ones who've been pulling the strings from the beginning. They're coming after us. They know you've been looking into them. We've been compromised." A chill ran down Hayes's spine. He had suspected this day would come, but hearing it from Isaiah's lips made it all the more real. "What do we do now?" "We fight back," Isaiah replied, his voice hard with resolve. "I've got a plan. Meet me tomorrow at the old warehouse on Elm Street. I'll tell you everything you need to know." The call ended abruptly, and Hayes sat there in the silence of his apartment, trying to process what Isaiah had just said. He wasn't sure what kind of fight Isaiah had in mind, but he knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back now. The path he had chosen was a dangerous one, and the consequences of failure were too great to even consider. The next day, Hayes found himself standing in front of the old warehouse, the cold wind biting at his skin as he waited for Isaiah to arrive. The place had been abandoned for years, the windows boarded up, the metal door rusted and weathered by time. It looked like the kind of place where people went to disappear, to hide. Hayes couldn't help but feel the weight of it all, the weight of the choices he had made that had led him here. Isaiah arrived a few minutes later, his figure emerging from the shadows. He didn't speak at first, just nodded toward the door. Hayes followed him inside, the air inside thick with the smell of mildew and dust. The warehouse was dimly lit, the only sounds the creaking of the old wooden beams above and the faint hum of machinery from somewhere deep within the building. "We're running out of time," Isaiah said once they were inside, his voice low. "We've been targeted. They'll come for us soon. We need to get this information out before they can stop us." Hayes nodded, his mind racing. "What's the plan? How do we expose them?" Isaiah led him to a table in the center of the room, where a laptop and a stack of papers were waiting. "This is everything we've got," Isaiah said, tapping the papers. "I've been in contact with a journalist from out of town, someone who's been investigating this same network. If we can get this information to them, we can blow the whole thing wide open. But we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more chance they'll get to cover their tracks." Hayes sat down at the table, his hands trembling slightly as he looked over the documents. There was no turning back now. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about exposing the truth, about putting an end to the conspiracy that had been controlling everything for so long. "We'll do it," Hayes said, his voice firm. "But we need to be careful. If they're as dangerous as you say, we can't afford any mistakes." Isaiah nodded. "I know. That's why we're going to need help. There are people out there who want to see this change. People who are tired of being controlled, tired of being silenced. We just need to find them." And with that, they began to put their plan into motion. It wasn't easy, there were false leads, dead ends, and moments of doubt. But slowly, piece by piece, they began to gather the evidence they needed. They contacted journalists, reached out to activists, and found allies in the most unexpected places. And as they pushed forward, the pressure mounted. The people behind the conspiracy weren't going to give up easily. They had resources, power, and influence on their side, and they weren't afraid to use them. But Hayes and Isaiah weren't backing down. They had come too far to turn back now. Every time they thought they were close to being caught, they found a way to slip through the cracks. They learned to watch their backs, to move in the shadows, and to trust no one except each other. Every decision they made had life-or-death consequences. But as the truth began to spread, as the story started to gain traction, they realized something that gave them hope: they weren't alone. This was just the beginning. The real fight was about to begin. And they were ready for it. There were people out there who were ready to fight for justice, ready to stand up to the powers that had controlled their lives for so long. The battle was far from over, but Hayes and Isaiah had taken the first step. They had opened the door, and now it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing through. They had risked everything for this moment, and as the storm began to gather around them, they knew there was no turning back.